Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. And so many of you have been longtime friends. So many of you have been involved in rap for a long, long time. Some of you barely know what rap is. So I've got something for everyone tonight. We're going to have fun. I'm going to take you on a trip. You may look at the very sophisticated logo on the screen up there. Not. Yeah. I'll tell you a story later about it. Well, actually, the picture of that house turned out to be the rap headquarters drawn from my front porch in a house I lived on probably 7 years before I knew that was going to be the rap headquarters. That was just the house I saw and I drew it. And so logos change with time. They get a little more sophisticated. And these logos are kind of a timeline of our neighborhood organization. And there we have today. So this is a fun story. It's got some sad parts to it, but it's meaningful to me in so many ways. It means a lot to me that you would come tonight to hear my version of this, and I promise you that everything I'm going to tell you tonight is true mostly. Let's begin. That's me sitting on the porch. I grew up in a small town called Belglade. If any of you know where it is, it's one of the greatest hellhole cities in the state of Florida. In fact, it was selected as the poorest city in Florida a few years ago. The word architecture probably has never been uttered within the city limits of Belglade. It's a plain, ordinary, little American town that's struggling to keep going like so many others. It was a great place to grow up because you didn't have to wear shoes in the summertime, you could run around. But my highlight of my life as a child was coming to Jacksonville to visit my grandparents' house on Riverside Avenue, 1035 Riverside Avenue, on the corner of Bishopgate Lane. This house was built in 1910 for Episcopal Bishop Edwin Weed, and it was one of the great houses along Riverside Avenue at the time. Now, my grandparents had this wonderful house. They would sometimes have 35 or 40 people for dinner. I knew they were so rich. It turns out it was a boarding house. And they bought it for $9,000 in the middle of the Depression. I don't know that they ever painted it, and they barely made their mortgage payments for the next 40 years. But for a child like me, coming to a house like this was a palace, a castle. It was remarkable with 18-foot ceilings. My brother and I sitting there on the front porch, that's me on the left. We could not go up to one of those columns and reach all the way around and touch each other. This was glory. Now, this house was part of a row of houses along Riverside Avenue. After the Great Fire of 1901, many of the wealthy people who formerly lived downtown in great mansions in the city that burned in the fire of 1901 moved to Riverside. And this was a row of houses like nothing else in Jacksonville. It was called one of the most beautiful streets in America. There were 50 or so of these large mansions that lined Riverside Avenue from about Forest Street up to where Memorial Park is today. And it was glorious. I mean, these were some of the houses that, would be the most beautiful house in any town in America. And here was a whole row of them. In fact, this street was known as one of the most beautiful streets in America. And some of these houses, you may have seen pictures of, some of you may have not. But there's a whole guide to these houses you can see along the row, some of the ones that we have photographs of. It was like nothing else. In the 1950s, in the 1960s, things changed. Interstate highways got built, taking people out to the hinterlands. Shopping malls pulled people away from the old urban core neighborhoods. In fact, when Jacksonville was consolidated in the late 60s, they zoned this area commercial, thinking that these old houses are too big for people to live in as homes anymore, and therefore they would let them turn into businesses and make them profitable. And the neighborhood slowly died. This great house was owned by the Champlin family, and that's where Blue Cross Blue Shield got built. This house was built for Hubbard. He was the wealthy hardware man who had a big role in Springfield. Those of you who've heard of Hubbard Street was named after him. And by the 1950s, it was a boarding house and next to a parking lot. This was the home of Mayor J.E.T. Bowden. He was the mayor during the fire. This gorgeous house was replaced by the Highway Patrol Station, and that was torn down in order to build the Red Cross building. This house was one of the finest Georgian mansions ever constructed in Jacksonville. It was built for the Coachman family, and it's still there underneath this. And if you walk through this building, you can make a doctor's appointment and go visit. When you're in the old building, you can tell because the floors don't sag when you walk. I tried to convince the guy that owns it to tear off that ugly mess. The ugly mess, by the way, was added by an architect, Brooks Haas, who owned the building back in the 60s. And he also was the architect who did the greatest sin for our neighborhood. He covered over the 5 Points building with stucco and made this hideous mess. But luckily, this is one of our great success stories. Mike Shadd bought the building and tore it off and restored it to one of the most beautiful 1920s buildings. So that's one that we won that one. So here's my grandmother's house. After my grandparents got old, they couldn't afford to keep such a big house and run the boarding house anymore. So they moved to a little bungalow in Ortega and leased the house to a fellow who had a restaurant there called La Maison. And man, he fancied it up. It had this French wallpaper, and it was, very, very expensive at the time. But it failed because he couldn't get a liquor license because he was too close to Riverside Presbyterian Church. And so then they turned it into a school for waiters and busboys and hotel workers, and they had a big fire in the kitchen. They never recovered from it, so it got torn down and is now on Riverside Avenue next to the Garden Club. The wonderful house of Colonel K, he was a Confederate colonel, and this was probably the biggest house along the row, was a pride of the neighborhood. And after he passed on, by the way, his name was spelled K-A-Y, Colonel K, and it got turned into Florida Junior College, which went on to become Jacksonville University. Jacksonville University got a start right here on Riverside Avenue, and then the house got torn down when they built the Fuller Warren Bridge and the I-95 Expressway. 2 blocks away was another Colonel K, spelled C-A-Y, another Confederate colonel, and this got turned into the Jacksonville Art Center, which went on to become MoCA today. And it's now this sad little doctor's office building. Across the street was the home of Lorenzo Wilson, and that became the Jacksonville Children's Museum, now MOSH, and today it looks like this. And Arthur and Nina Cummer's wonderful Tudor mansion was torn down, of course, to build the Cummer Museum. So what did I just say? Within a 3-block area, MOSH, the Cummer, JU, and MoCA all got founded in a 3-block area of Riverside Avenue. Who would have thunk it? This was a very rich cultural area. And if you haven't heard about the Riverside Avondale Cultural Trail that our organization is going to be building over the next year, wait till you see that. It's a very rich area that you'll be able to go by and see what was once there. Mr. Munoz's house, this wonderful shingle-style house, was torn down to build what is now a mid-century modern landmark, trade one for the other, designed by Taylor Hardwick. The old Lomax Castle was by a German man named Weibert, Weibert. And when rap first started, this house was still standing. Friends of mine, hippies, lived there. I have wonderful pictures of them standing up on the roof, smoking pot. And I didn't do it. No. But a guy came in and said, I'm going to save this house, and he was going to, instead of moving, he was going to take it apart piece by piece, which he did. And then they got halfway through, he left town. The building was torn down and is now Park Plaza condos. So many people don't know this building existed. It was a little further down Riverside. The Standard Oil building was clad with marble, had a tile roof, was beautiful. It was like a Mediterranean palace. And that was torn down, and Fidelity is now there on Riverside Avenue. This was Dr. Rogers Hospital, built in the 20s, a 3-story brick building. And this was torn down to build Riverside Hospital. But Riverside Hospital wanted to expand even more, and so they built even a bigger building. This was back in the 70s, after I'd moved to Jacksonville in the early 70s. And they built this. And in building that, they tore down the most significant architectural house in Riverside, Clutho's George W. Clark residence, a beautiful, beautiful prairie-style building. And that's the site where Publix is today. And as they were tearing this down, it was just so wrong for them to do that. This great building. I went out in the middle of Goodwin and Riverside Avenue and shook my fist and condemned Riverside Hospital to hell. Riverside Hospital, as they expanded, bought up block after block after block. And in a 1.5-year period, over 30 houses were torn down. And you see some of those houses here in their last days as the hospitals ravaged. I went to a meeting of the board of Riverside Hospital. Charlie Towers, the attorney, many of you knew him, was the chairman of the board. And I begged him to save the George W. Clark house. And he looked at me and said, son, in 10 years, there's not going to be a single house left between here and St. Vincent's Hospital. That was terrible. I won. So when they did finally tear down Riverside Hospital, I went back out on the corner of Riverside and Goodwin and said, thank you. And we got a Publix out of it. Down the blocks, quarter mile away, was St. Vincent's Hospital. It started out as a beautiful, lovely little riverfront hospital, and it got bigger. And this picture was taken in 1989, but as it got bigger, St. Vincent's Hospital bought up all the property around them as far as they could, every single property. And many of them they kept, but they were bankrolling them for later expansion of the hospital. And they cut down first all the trees, and wonderful houses like this prairie-style house designed by Mark and Sheftall was one of the first to go. And this house was, when you tear down a house and you build a parking lot, the house next to it becomes unlivable, and so people move away, and the house becomes less valuable, and then they can buy that for cheap and buy the next one and so forth. I lived in that house across the parking lot. And that pile of wood is the house where I used to live. House after house went down, and this was between 71 and 74. Probably 50 or 60 houses were torn down between King Street and Margaret Street. The neighborhood was dying. It was a cancer. And once a house goes, people move away. The next house goes, they become commercialized, and they tear it down for an office building. And all these houses, within a short period of time, went. And I don't have pictures of all of them because I missed taking pictures of them because they got torn down. And a lot of houses didn't get torn down but became changed from residential to commercial. And of course, if you live next to a commercial business, you're not as likely to stay there for long. And so this was a cancer on the neighborhood. And I did not know anything about history. I did not know anything about preservation. I didn't even know the word preservation. But as you see these old houses get used for things that they weren't intended to, like a playground or a kindergarten, house after house gets ruined. This was an important house on the corner of Riverside and Cherry. It was an amazing prairie-style house built in 1913. And in the 1940s, some doctors bought it and made it into a hospital. They built a one-story concrete addition on the front that covered most of the front, went all the way to the sidewalk, jalousie windows. It was a disaster. That's a great house today. So, began a movement. The first part of this movement happened in 1967. Helen Lane was the first mover and shaker of historic preservation in Jacksonville. She was very sentimental. She loved Victorian architecture. This house was over on Post Street where RPDS is today, and they were going to tear it down to build a parking lot for RPDS. So she moved it over to Post Street. And that was the first house I know of that got intentionally saved with a preservation ethic. Ironically, as RPDS expanded, they needed this property, so they moved the house back within 50 feet of where it originally was, as is now the office for RPDS. But it's still there, 1893. In 1973, the Jacksonville Area Planning Department did a study of Riverside. And it showed how important the neighborhood was and how it could be facilitated to save this old neighborhood. This is my old house. I'll tell you a little bit about it. When I moved to Jacksonville in 1971, I'd graduated from Emory University as an English major, and I wanted to be a writer and an artist, and I realized I wasn't very good at any of that. I had an uncle here in Jacksonville who was an optometrist, and he had the best life. He didn't work hard. He went to parties. He'd walk down the street, and 100 people would come up and say hello to him. And I said, I might be able to do that and still be a poor writer and artist and have fun. So I went to optometry school in Houston, graduated in '71, and then came to Jacksonville to go into partnership with my uncle, who didn't work very hard, and moved into this house. Now this is not, if this house was still there, it would not be one of the great architectural landmarks, but it's part of the fabric of the neighborhood. I rented this house from Burbridge Realty for $110 a month, 1971. Later, I realized that Burbridge was renting it for St. Vincent's. There were 5 houses in a row, similar in style, kind of a prairie-style feel to it, but nothing great. But in those, when I moved in, my neighbors were really cool. 3 of them were planners with the Jacksonville Area Planning Board. And some houses had 5 and 10 people living in them. I lived there by myself. But we called it Fagawi Heights. It was a little colony of these old houses of people who lived there. And sitting in my living room in this house one day, we were bemoaning how all these houses were being torn down, and the city didn't care. There was nobody that would do anything to stop it. It was going to keep on going until the neighborhood was a wasteland or one continuous hospital. And other things were happening. FSCJ, then known as FCJ, was expanding, knocking down houses over on that corner of the neighborhood. Churches were expanding and buying up old houses and tearing them down to build parking lots for churches like this one. I mean, the houses here are torn down so you could park tonight, not have to walk through the rain too far. But anyway, all this was happening, and so my 3 friends who were sitting in the living room with me that day, the first one was Paul Kittis. Some of you may have known him. Paul was a very exuberant, philosophical, meditative person. And another friend was David Malby, a big bear of a man who was just kind and gentle. And he's the one that wrote the Riverside Area Study that I showed you a minute ago. He worked for the Planning Commission. And the third was Ari White. Ari was also a planner. And those 3 of my friends, we started talking about it. We realized it was wrong. And so somebody, I believe it may have been Paul, said, let's start an organization to stop this crap. He didn't say crap, but. And so I said, that's a great idea. Who's going to be the leader? And they said, you are, Wayne. You're the only one that has a suit. And so that's how I got 3 people stepped backward, and I was standing there in front. So we decided we did 2 things. George Harmon was the editor of the Jacksonville Journal at the time, and we went and talked to him, and he said, I'm going to do an article about this for you. And we put up little handbills all around the neighborhood that said, Save Riverside. See at the bottom of the name of the organization, Riverside Area Preservation, RAP. Great name for an organization, Riverside Area Preservation. So this February 14th, 1974, we've put all these pamphlets out. George has written an article in the Times-Union, and we go to the Times-Union auditorium. It's seated 75 people. 150 people showed up. They were out in the lobby. Man, we were on to something. I mean, this was something else. And we did not discover till at least a year later that we were part of a national movement. In older neighborhoods like Riverside, Avondale, Springfield, that kind of engulf downtown areas, they were all having the same trouble. People were moving out to the suburbs, shopping malls and so forth. Downtown neighborhoods were dying. And we looked around, all of a sudden, we were part of a national movement. It was happening everywhere, but we didn't know it at first. We were isolated. We were just looking out for our yard. And again, I'm not an architect, I'm not a preservationist, I'm not a historian, I'm an environmentalist. And we realized that the urban environment is just as fragile as the natural environment, maybe even more so because the urban environment has people in it. That's a dangerous place to be. So anyway, we did this, and we collected 25 cents from everybody in the audience. We made $43, and that was our treasury, and we were off and rolling. And we had committees, and we decided, we had all these bright ideas, and this was actually just like a laboratory of how many creative ideas can you have, and what all things can you do if you have a neighborhood organization. First of all, we wanted to be a chamber of commerce for an old neighborhood. Bay Meadows, Deerwood, and all those places that were new subdivisions had multi-million-dollar advertising firms advertising them. So we were going to be a little nonprofit, grassroots chamber of commerce for this old neighborhood, and we were going to throw everything we had at it to make people want to come here and appreciate it and love it and to defend it. And so that's what we did. We put out a little newsletter. It came out every month. We had a crew of people that did the newsletter. And on the right, you'll see an article about street widening. We heard a rumor that they were going to widen all the big major streets in Riverside and maybe even build an expressway through it. So we called the city and had them send out their star traffic engineer. His name was Steve Tognell. We had a meeting at the Garden Club, and I swear there were at least 200 people there. And Steve had one of the worst nights of his life. You're going to build what in our neighborhood? And then, to make matters worse, a few months later, they came out with a map to actually show it. It was called the JUAT study, Jacksonville Urban Area Transit Study. And here you see a picture of it. On the top left, you see the Riverside Freeway. But the one that was a clincher was the one that went right through Jennifer Johnson's house on Richmond Street to connect to, it was called the River Oaks Freeway, going to build a bridge. So we called another meeting. This didn't get built, or do you think it? I know. It was going to go from as you see, right here is Avondale Shopping Center is right there. So these were just lines on paper, but that's the way transportation planners do things. They put lines on paper. But I've never been one to use a crisis, to waste a crisis. This was a chance. So before we started out being Riverside Area Preservation, and very early on we realized that although Avondale was not immediately threatened, it would be if we didn't do something. This cancer was spreading, so we changed the name to Riverside Avondale Preservation, and we called a big meeting. Steve, I don't know if you were at this one. I think you may have been too wounded to show up at this. It was a Kistling Auditorium at Riverside Presbyterian Church, which seats about 300 people. We had 600 people there. There were people outside like this looking in the windows. And there were a whole panel of people from the area planning board on the stage, and they had the worst night of their life, I guarantee you. 3 months later, the Riverside Freeway and the River Oaks Freeway were off the map. And, well, again, I never want to have a crisis that go to waste. And so for years after that, people would suggest stuff about our neighborhood, and they say, you can't do that in Riverside, they're too well organized. Well, whatever. So we did stuff. Again, public relations, promotion. We had 4th of July picnics every year in the park, in Boone Park. We had bluegrass music. We had hundreds of people come, and this gave us, if you know about placemaking, it gives a sense of place, that this is important. This is a special place in the universe, and that builds patriotism. We had sack races. Remember sack races? We had watermelon eating contests. We had fun. We had clowns and all that. So this was just one event we put on. And I don't know how we had time to do all this, but we did stuff all the time. And there's Roger on the left and Jack on the right, and I still remember both of them. And then we had another crisis. We kind of knew we had to do work on the zoning, because the zoning in the neighborhood was terrible. We got into the first big zoning fight on this building. It's on St. John's Avenue, now lovingly restored. But they wanted to build a 15-story high-rise right next to Broadview Terrace. Broadview Terrace had been built about 5 years before that, and we could start to see that there was going to be high-rises all along the river from 5 Points to Avondale. And so we had to stop this. In our first big zoning fight, we won and stopped them. And now the house has been lovingly restored and one of the great landmarks in the neighborhood. One of our members said, let's do a home tour. And said, what's a home tour? I mean, people did not do home tours before 1974 anywhere in the United States. This was a new thing. Michael Brown was an interior designer. He said, we're going to do a home tour. He got 5 of his wealthy clients to open their doors. We did the first home tour in November of 1974, and we've done quite a few since then. And that's been not just a way to promote the neighborhood, but it gives the people who live here a sense of pride that we have houses that people would pay to come see. In this case, I think it was $5. But also it brings people into the neighborhood who love what they see and want to move here. So we're building a constituency. Our little newsletter kept on going. In 1975, we had the first art festival in the parking lot of First Guarantee Bank. It was bleak, friends. It was bleak. But it was a start. And so within a few years, we realized this was not a good idea. And so we moved it to the park, and it was in, also after the art festival, we hired our first executive director, Henry McCartney. Anybody here remember Henry? Henry was a mild-mannered, brilliant guy who quit his job with the city to come to work for RAP for $100 a week, 25 hours a week. He was a part-time, but he helped us get organized and helped organize the committees. We had hundreds of volunteers were just pouring in. It was wonderful. And we had our first headquarters in this house on the corner of Bars and Urshel. Then it was Laura's Tea House. It was a little restaurant, and she gave us this little room right up here on the top right. It was about 10 square feet, and that's where Henry had his office, and that's where RAP really moved to the next level. We had wonderful events. We called them block parties, where we get a whole block together. We would also have restoration parties where people who were restoring their house, these young professionals in their 20s, we'd have a potluck dinner and have people come over, and they'd swap war stories about removing wallpaper and scraping plaster and all that. And Iris Eisenberg. Where are you, Iris? Okay, Iris, Dr. Eisenberg offered free tetanus shots to anybody who came to these parties, because we were always jabbing ourselves with rusty nails and all that. It was brilliant. Thank you, Iris. I appreciate it. I never got tetanus. And we did other things. We had a craftsman list, people who were recommended to do your roof, to be a chimney sweep, to do all the things you needed for old houses. We had a tool library. We had wallpaper steamers, 12-foot extension ladders. You could come, if you're a RAP member, and check those out and go restore your house. And remember, this is the early 1970s. Most of the houses in the neighborhood that had not been torn down were in, second, third generation needed repair as old people got old and moved on. So all these houses were built with were repaired with sweat equity. And it was a wonderful thing to see. Everywhere you looked, there were houses being fixed up. And so now we're actually in the second generation of restoration of some of these old houses. My friend Gunnell Humphreys, y'all know Gunnell, she runs Edge City today. In fact, I talked her and Tom into buying that store. It used to be a hippie head shop. And she was a great artist, so I convinced her to be the official rap artist. And she drew pictures of all the houses and illustrated all of our newsletters, home tour programs. And later on, we did a show of her work I'll tell you about later. So I'm not as bold as I used to be. But we called Mayor Tanzler's office and said, we want to do a big show in the Cummer Museum. Can we use your name to endorse it? And whoever answered the phone said, sure, don't bother. So I sent out a postcard forging Hans Tanzler's signature on it. We sent 10,000 of those out, telling everybody that we could get on their list. We were going to do a show in the Cummer. Now, I also went over to Bob Schlageter was the director of the Cummer at the time, very conservative. In fact, the Cummer was very conservative. They sort of didn't want people to come there because they were housing art. First, certain people could come and look at it, but it was not really open to the community. So I gave them this pitch about we could do an exhibit in the Cummer called The Neighborhood is Art. Think about that title. Actually, the neighborhood is a work of art. And if we do an exhibit in the museum of the artwork in the neighborhood, then people will go outside the museum and look at the neighborhood and see what a beautiful work of art it is. I don't know if Schlageter was drunk that day or what, but he said, okay, we have this gallery available. It was the big gallery. And so we did it. The night before the show opened, everything was on the floor. There was nothing hanging. And on the day it opened, 1,000 people came to that exhibit. They were lined up down Riverside Avenue. It is the largest art exhibit at any museum in Jacksonville in history until MoCA had the Imagination Squared exhibit, and they had a bigger attendance. So this was something. And it was a beautiful exhibit. We had many of the photographs I'm showing you here. We had stained glass windows. We had old mantles. But what happened was it was a huge crowd. They had to take on extra security. And people came to the exhibit who had long hair and were wearing blue jeans. In the Cummer. In the Cummer, long hair and blue jeans. And even worse, there were a lot of people there with plaid pants. I mean, plaid pants. Dave Malby drew up a whole series of drawings about urban planning in the neighborhood and how zoning affected the neighborhood. This was a great exhibit. Gunnell had a whole section by herself of her artwork that was beautifully decorated like you would expect at Edge City. So what happened to the exhibit? They closed it 2 weeks early. It was too popular. All these people coming in the Cummer, they had to put on extra security. It was just driving their budget to the roof. They closed it 2 weeks early. The greatest exhibit the Cummer's ever had. So next we had another zoning battle. This was a big one. And you see in our little newsletter, it talks about Powell Place. Powell Place is a 1 block long street that was zoned commercial. We're just 1 block from the hospital. And we knew if it stayed that way, that every house on that block was going to be gone and it'd be part of the hospital. So we did the revolutionary idea of downzoning, where you change zoning from a higher level to a lower level residential. And we lost. Somehow, with all the things we did in the years after that, Powell Place is still there. A few houses are gone, but most of that block is still intact. But we realize that zoning is our lifeline. Zoning tells what you can do in a building, and if you have bad zoning, the neighborhood dies. So in 1976, I did my first book ever. I've done 14 more books since then, but this was a special book that I did research. I didn't know anything about history, but we realized that what do we have to promote this neighborhood? We got architecture, we got history, we got scenery, cool people. So I did my research and became an expert as best I could on neighborhood architecture and wrote this little book. You can still get these sometimes on eBay for a couple $100. It's a little small book, but I was very proud of that book. It was the first one I ever did. And then we got a house of our own. A friend of mine said, I'll give you this house. We've moved out of it. It's on Riverside Avenue, where the Dillon parking garage is today. If you will restore it, and you can have it rent-free for 2 years, and after that, we'll talk about what to do. They eventually sold it to St. Vincent's. But this was our headquarters, a great house. We had boardrooms and all that. And then we did another book. A friend of mine, George Hallam, was a professor at JU, and he wrote a book called Riverside Remembered that had the story of Mellon Greeley, one of our city's great architects, and how the row was built, much of the things we discussed earlier. And then we said, well, how can we make some money? How can we make a lot of money? And I said, let's have a party. The old train station had been empty for 20 years. Amtrak had moved their station out to the north side or the west side or wherever it is. And so this building, our greatest classical monument, was deteriorating rapidly. It was filled with homeless people and pigeons and so forth. So I went over to the CSX building, went up to the top floor, and had an appointment with Prime Osborne, who was the president of the railroad. And I walked in, Mr. Osborne was sitting there with a big cigar, a three-piece suit. And I said, Mr. Osborne, I'd like to borrow your station for a few months. He said, I remember his laugh. He put down a cigar and said, tell me about it. And I told him I wanted to do a big party to get people excited about the station. He said, son, you'd have to have $1 million of insurance before I'd let you do that. 2 days later, I brought him a certificate for $1 million of insurance from Hardin Insurance Company. And so we did. This is crazy. The ceiling had been lowered to about 20 feet during the days of the expensive air conditioning when Amtrak ran the station. And so nobody has seen the big vaulted dome in the big area for a long time. And so Burkhalter was a friend of mine, the wrecking company, and I said, I'll trade you. If you'll take that false ceiling out, I'll give you the steel. And so he said, I'll do that. There was a lot of steel in there. So they took out the false ceiling, and then I got some kids from the Juvenile Delinquent Center, the probation is resident program, to come in and haul away all the asbestos and pigeon droppings and all the trash. There had been fires started in there and people were burning stuff. And so I hope they're okay. All that insulation stuff. And so we cleaned it out. And in November, I guess it was 1976, we had the biggest party Jacksonville's ever had. And by that time, we had honed our promotional skills. Every day in the Times-Union on the front page, they had an article about the train station, part of its history and all that, for 2 weeks leading up to this. Everybody in town had to come, and they did. We had a 16-piece orchestra on the stage. In the African-American waiting room, we had a jazz combo. 8,000 people came, and they were lined up down Bay Street to get in. This is a time when nobody would be on Bay Street at night. There were 8,000 people lined up to get in. We had searchlights up in the sky. We did it really well. We had a casino, and we had nickel beer. People were so drunk they could not fall over because it was too crowded. This was the greatest party in Jacksonville history. Here's some of the money we printed up for the casino. We had, it was in the old restaurant, and we had roulette wheels and poker and all that. It was a heck of a party. And then we made $43,000 in one night, by the way, $43,000. That was big bucks back then. And we used that to start a revolving fund to buy up old houses, fix them up, and sell them, and keep putting the money back in. So a year later, we said, let's do it again. So we had the station restoration celebration to celebrate the coming restoration of the building. And two buddies from Robert E. Lee met at that party and saw each other after a long time. They said, let's save this building, and they bought it and later sold it to the city. So RAP, even though it's not in our neighborhood, we're responsible for saving that old building, 1978. And it's still there today as our convention center because of RAP. So the next dilemma comes along with one of our big mansions on King Street, the Martha Washington Hotel. And we say this building was originally a residence for the Blunt family. In the 1940s, they built a huge addition on the back to make it into a residential hotel. And the owners of the building asked the George Washington Hotel for permission to call it the Martha Washington Hotel, which would be some sort of counterpoint to that. And it was during the war, and they had lots of young people living there. And then in the 60s, the Riverside Baptist Church bought it, and they didn't want to keep it up. They had a home for old folks in there, and after a while, the person who was running that got tired of it, so they decided to tear it down because of the land value, not seeing the architectural and historic value. So the wrecking ball was out there. The ball swung back, came in and hit the side of the wall, and the ball went back again and broke. And just at that moment, I was meeting on the porch with 3 members of the Riverside Baptist Church. And I said, we're going to buy it. I hereby offer you to buy this building. And I pulled out a check for $7,000 from Jennifer Johnson and said, here's a down payment. And they said, no, son, we're not going to do that. And I said, no, stop. Hold off the wrecking crew. We are going to buy it. Here's a down payment. And they said, no, son. So standing next to me was Cynthia Parks. They didn't know who she was. She was a top writer for the Jacksonville Journal. So the next day in headlines, it said something to the effect of Preservation Group offers to buy a building and Baptist Church refuses. Oh, they looked bad. And one of the quotes in the article was, unknown to the Baptist Church representatives, I was standing right next to this reporter. She said this reporter was standing next to him when he made the offer, and although they denied it, he made the offer, and so within a period of time, they took our $7,000. And then we got together a group of 20 RAP members who each gave $1,000 to the Martha Washington Limited to buy, and then we bought the building. And so here's a picture of us celebrating on the front porch when we bought the building. This was one of our great saves, and grassroots as you get, but we did it. And the building is still there today. That was me drinking champagne. So then we had bicycle races. At one point we did them down Herschel Street by Boone Park. And then we also did one around the big loop at FSCJ. That was a great bicycle. We had 100 or so bicyclists. And then in 1979, I resigned as chairman. I'd done it for 5 years. I was not tired of it, but I realized that if I did not step down, this organization would be totally dependent on me and people wouldn't do work. And it needed to go on, much like the Riverside Arts Market. We pass it on. So on our board of directors was this fellow, Noel Vivian. He was the president of Ivy's department store, very well thought of, which gave much more clout to our organization by having him. And he became the first in a series of many chairmen of RAP. And then we moved our arts festival to Riverside Park, and then it really took off and became one of the great regional art festivals. Elaine and Cindy Guy were very involved in that. I don't see them here. So then we had another zoning battle. Are y'all getting tired of this? I can quit. No. More? Okay, thank you. And I'll be quick. So this was the biggie. They wanted to build a 19-story condo on top of this, where the old chic mansion would be the entrance to the condo, and then 19 stories up, you'd have the riverfront building. We hired the best money that politicians could buy, the best attorney, and we won. Remember I mentioned a while ago, Riverside remembered about the architect Mellon Greeley? He came to he lived in Jacksonville in the 1880s. He shook hands with President Grover Cleveland. That's how old he was. He turned 100, and so we celebrated him at a rap meeting. And you can see back here is Preston Haskell is right there. And we helped him blow out his 100 candle on the cake. It was a sweet moment in our organization's history. And then we worked for 6 or 7 years doing the research to be National Register Historic District. We finally got that. Huge boost for the neighborhood. Then a guy named Jay McGarvey had the idea to do luminarias at Christmas time. And we said, what's a luminaria? Apparently, he'd seen it up in New England. He thought it was a good idea. So he and Jerry Spinks got together. And ever since then, we've had luminarias that make our neighborhood so good. Do you see all these things we're doing? Placemaking. They're making our neighborhood special. People outside the neighborhood, people inside the neighborhood realize how special it is, and they stand up for it. Bayard's place is a 1-block-long brick street. The paving machines came out one morning to pave over it. The neighbors, led by Mitch Woodleaf, he's standing there in the middle. He lives on the corner. So they went out and stood in front of the paving machines, and we called Mayor Azuri. Mayor Azuri came out, took one look at the paving machine. There'd been about 15 feet of asphalt put on top of the brick. He looked at the crowd behind him. He looked at the paving machine and said, "Scrape it." And then he said, "I will help you repave this street. If you guys will pull up the bricks, I'll have the Public Works Department come back and lay them back down." And that is exactly what they did. People power, neighborhood power, it pays off. It's still there today, one of our 3 brick streets. So there are a lot of little houses like this that, may not catch your eye, but it has a history. This little house was owned by a family who had the French primary school kindergarten, the Buckland family. Mr. Buckland was friends with President Rutherford B. Hayes. They went to Rutherford B. Hayes' inauguration. And Ms. Buckland there had these cute little students. She taught French and other primary school things. And this guy right here is Charlie Towers. And all the really top citizens in Jacksonville went to Ms. Buckland's school. So Ms. Buckland and her relatives passed away, and the sister, I believe it was, of the deceased owner offered to give this to RAP through the efforts of a RAP member, Ed Livesey, who knew her, talked her into giving this to RAP free and clear. And so in 1991, RAP owned its first piece of real estate. And there is Charlie Towers cutting the ribbon for the Buckland house. What a wonderful circle that is. Carmen, I think you're in the picture somewhere. And there's Leslie Keys, some of you remember her. There's Mitch Woodleaf. So all of what we've done is try to promote restoration, pride in the neighborhood, and so forth. And we had the idea of putting signs up on houses that say Riverside Avondale Preservation, knowing that if somebody has a sign on their house, they're probably not going to screw it up too badly. And the more people have these signs on their houses, the more people will say, well, I want to be part of that. This neighborhood is special. So if you don't have a sign on your house, we have them. And you should put one up. I mean, it's really important. If every house in the neighborhood had a sign like this, our troubles would be over. But restoration began, and young folks, young professionals, neo-hippies, people just getting out of college moved into the neighborhood and started fixing up houses. It was wonderful. And so these old places got a second life. One thing that happened is the hospital has expanded, still trying to save the buildings. We moved them. We moved 19 houses, as I recall. A few of them got moved out of the neighborhood, but most of them stayed in the neighborhood and just found an empty lot. And here you see the first house we moved. This was on the corner of Goodwin and Herschel, I believe. Still there today. And the guy behind all this was Jerry Spinks. Jerry Spinks was the greatest preservationist Jacksonville has ever known. He was not only chairman of RAP, he was chairman of the Jacksonville Historical Society and the Jacksonville Preservation Commission. He saved more houses than probably any other human being. And there are 4 or 5 of us out in front of the Riverside Avondale Preservation House. Eventually St. Vincent's got around to saying they bought it, and they say, we're going to tear it down unless you move it. So we moved it over to Powell Place, and it's still there today, thanks to Jerry Spinks. Here's another house in St. Vincent's. Was going to take out. We moved that. That one went down the river, but at least it got saved. And here's one the Suslaks moved from the end of King Street over to Powell Place, one of the great houses. It's in my new book. So we're getting close to the end, but I got a few more stories to tell you. As an optometrist, optometry is pretty boring. I mean, optometrists are pretty boring, but I was on the lecture circuit. It was what I did just to have fun and travel around. So I was giving a speech to the Oregon State Optometric Association in Portland in 1994. So after I was through with my talk, I wanted to go down and see some architecture in downtown Portland, noted for some beautiful buildings. And I didn't want to hang out with optometrists, so I got on the trolley and I was going to downtown Portland. As I got on the edge of town, there was a man in the middle of the road juggling fire. Juggling fire, you don't get that every day. And so I got off the trolley at the next stop and came and looked, and under the Burnside Bridge in Portland, Oregon, was the Portland Saturday Market. You know, it rains all the time in Seattle and Portland out there, so they can't do outdoor festivals dependably. And so they had it under the bridge, which was a genius idea. Now, this bridge is kind of low and dark, but they had several hundred vendors, and they've been going at it for over 40 years. And so I said, that is a cool idea. I came back to Jacksonville, and my very first patient, Eugene, was an engineer for the Florida Department of Transportation, and he was in charge of designing the new Fuller Warren Bridge. Oh, just like the gods in heaven spoke to me. And I said, Gene, we got to do this. And he said, we got to do it on the river. We have that whole area. It's going to be covered, and the new bridge is going to be 3 times higher and wider than the old bridge. This is a perfect idea. He said, Wayne, I'm sorry, but at the bottom of the bridge, there's going to be a retention pond with a chain link fence around it to take all the water off the bridge. You can't make water run uphill, so it has to go there. And I said, Gene, that's what engineers do. They make water run uphill. And so he said, well, we'll see. And so I had this idea, and I told everybody to rap about it at the board. I talked to the mayor about it. I talked to the city council about it. We contacted the governor's office. And I went through 4 mayors and 5 governors before the damn thing got built. But we did it. So that same year, we came out with our 3rd book, and this also accompanied a new exhibit in the Cummer. By this time, they were lightening up a little bit, and they kind of realized this was a pretty good thing to have all these people come to the Cummer. So we had an exhibit called The Living Heritage of Riverside Avondale that was like the first exhibit, only 100 times better. And then we got approved for a local historic district. Now, this is important. Most people think the National Register is the historic district, and we are a National Register historic district. But that has nothing but glory to it, and maybe a little tax incentives for some commercial buildings. But the real meat is in the preservation ordinance that designates a local area historic, and it and if you're going to mess up a house, you're going to tear it down or you're going to alter the facade or the important historical parts, you've got to get a certificate of appropriateness. So this was the thing we wanted more than anything else. And finally, in 1997, we did it. Now, people said, people are not going to go for that. They're not going to let you take away the rights to their property. Property, that's the way they pronounced it when they said that. 80% of the neighbors who voted in favor of the local historic designation. I've been giving speeches and sermons to San Marco for all this time, saying, you got to do this. This is what's going to save San Marco. And they said, we're not going to let the government, that's the way to pronounce it, government have any say-so over our property. And they've lost 30 of their greatest houses in the last 15, 20 years, turned into McMansions. But we did it, and this has been the glue that has taken all those early things we did and carried our neighborhood forward. Now, I'm going to go back and say this. RAP does not tell anybody what to do with their property. That is a common misnomer. We don't have any control over it. It's the Historic Preservation Commission appointed by the city that has the rules and regulations, and RAP has nothing to do with it. Now, if you want to change your windows or do something like that, come to us and we'll advise you how to get the process through. We'll show you how to do it so you can get it past the commission. But we don't have any sheriff responsibilities. We're the good guys. We're helping people save this neighborhood and make it better. So tell everybody you know that. And then one of my long-term wishes in the original Riverside area plan was to turn College and Post Street into two-way streets. They were the main thoroughfare. They didn't get to build the Riverside Expressway earlier. This was a main expressway with people going 55 miles an hour through the neighborhood from downtown to Orange Park and so forth. And so we had to do this. We slowed it down, made it two-way, and within a period of 10 years, 80% of the houses went from rental units to homeowner limited units. It's just a traffic theory that David Maltby had back in 1973, and it worked. So meanwhile, remember 1994 is when I gave him a speech out in Portland. And here we are, 2001. They're still trying to get the bridge built. And I'm still talking to the mayor and the governor and everybody trying to keep it. I didn't want her to come up and say, if you just had this idea a few months ago, we could have done it, but now it's too late. Or if you have it too early, then everybody loses interest, which is exactly what happened. So they were finally getting the bridge done. It's coming closer. And I was at a RAP board meeting, and I said, we got to do something about this. The bridge is going to be completed soon. This was in 2007. And I said, there's a gorilla in this room, and nobody's talking about it. We have the idea to do a market under the bridge, and if we don't start now, we're not going to make it. And the chairman of RAP at the time, who will go nameless, said, we don't have enough bandwidth to do it. Forget about it. Let somebody else do it, or just forget the idea. We didn't forget about it. I was on fire about this idea. I knew it would work. And so I got the chairman to appoint Doug Coleman, and if you know Doug, he's a force of nature, to take on a committee to see if we could make a market under the bridge. And he appointed Teresa Fish, Cindy Guy, Pamela Tellis, and me to be on his committee. And we did not have any idea how to do a farmer's market, artist market, whatever. But we learned. We were called the Ramrods. And over a period of a year, we designed the market under the bridge. And it became the Riverside Arts Market. And on the day it opened, we had no idea if anybody would come. I mean, it was new. And we had a little publicity, but I didn't get as much publicity as I usually like to get. And we went there in the morning, and the cars were lined up all the way down to the Times Union building. And it was said that 30,000 people came to RAM that day. It may have been me, huh? But anyway, a lot of people came. And it was the best day of my life. Most of the vendors sold out by noontime. It was just overwhelming. And here we're the principle of the market is you can't sell it unless you make it or grow it. So you can't buy stuff in China and come sell them. And it took a while to get people used to that. But this is a handmade market where people work on their products during the week, art, food, whatever, and then they sell it on the weekend. And we have 150 people every week making their living under the bridge. Come rain or shine, it's fun under the bridge, and I hope y'all continue to enjoy it and support it the way it was meant to be. And then, remember Steve Cocknell, that guy that we gave such a hard time back at that meeting about the expressways? He was a loyal RAP board member for all that, and his wife Margaret was over here too, was their chairman. And he nominated Riverside Avondale for the American Planning Association to be one of the great places in America. And we won the award of one of the 10 great neighborhoods in America. So from that cancer back in 1974, we're now one of the great neighborhoods in America. And the year we got selected, one of the other 10 neighborhoods was Oak Park, Frank Lloyd Wright's neighborhood in Chicago. That's pretty high cotton. So our original idea was that we would save the neighborhood. We were so naive. We'd save the neighborhood and then we could quit. It would just be a great neighborhood and people would come and it'd be fine. The better we make the neighborhood, the harder it gets. Every year somebody wants to come in and do something ugly. Somebody who does not live here wants to come in and reap the benefits of all this work we've been doing to make it a great place. We defeated this, but there will be more just like it, right behind it.
Where was that?
That was going to be where the Commander Apartments were.
Would have been better.
And something got built there, but not as bad as that. So, in closing, I just want to point out this statistic. There have been 31 chairpersons for RAP. You look over that list and see some of the most wonderful people I know, leaders, par excellence, that have made this neighborhood great through their service, through their persistence, through their determination to lead. And we owe all these people a great round of thanks. And you see many of these people in the room tonight. But also, we've had 15 executive directors, several of which are in the room tonight. And we're just so blessed to have had such great leadership. You can see how long they served. In fact, the shortest serving executive director was Paul Kittis. He was one of the guys in my living room, and he was available when Henry McCartney retired. He was not a great executive director at RAP. And we were good friends, so I told him that. And so he lasted 6 months. But the 6 longest serving executive directors were Henry McCartney, who now lives up in New York. I talk to him from time to time. Meredith Craig, one of the dearest people I've ever known. He passed away about 9 years ago. Bonnie Grissett, she was executive director longer than any other person. She was Mother RAP to all of us, and she passed away as well. But she did a great service to the neighborhood. I've already mentioned Jerry Spinks. Jerry Spinks was Mr. Preservation for Jacksonville, and he did so much, not just in our neighborhood, but all over town. And he sadly passed away suddenly. But this woman didn't pass away. She's still on fire. Carmen Godwin. Let's give her a round of applause. And the other of the 6 longest serving executive directors was Warren Jones, our previous director, who is he was a great breath of fresh air for our organization. And he was sorry he couldn't be here tonight. He's traveling. So what does all this stuff mean that I've told you? You know, this is an organization that nobody knew would last more than a year. Next year is going to be 50 years. And it's because of you and people like you and people who came before you and people who are going to come after you who believe in this, who see the neighborhood as art, as a quality of life mecca for us to share our values It's a very diverse neighborhood, gay, straight, black, white, young, old, rich, poor. That eclecticism is part of its value to us, and we need to keep that. But also we need to realize that the urban environment is even more fragile than the natural environment, and we're living in it. So we have to remember to inspire those who come after us. Where are all the young? We need some teenagers in this room. Really, rap is an ongoing thing. And, you think of the houses now, architecture is the most fragile of all the arts. A building made of stone or steel is less likely to survive than a poem or a play or a book or a painting. So 100 years from now, will there be anything left of Riverside Avondale? These buildings that we cherish today, will they be underwater? Will they have deteriorated? Will a cycle go by where people just don't care anymore? I don't know that. I have great hopes. I have hopes in you and hopes in the generation to follow, that this little organization that just grew up out of the grassroots like nothing you've ever seen is now the largest historic neighborhood preservation organization in the South. Thanks to you.
If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about the work of Riverside Avondale Preservation, follow us online. We're on all social media.
Thank you for helping us to preserve the most architecturally diverse historic neighborhood in the United States. To support our efforts, you can become a member or consider donating at riversideavondale.org today.
If you're ever looking for more information about what's coming up with RAP, we post all of our information on our channels and on our website. So if you're looking for information about our upcoming events, such as our annual home tour, our garden tour, holiday-themed Luminaria event, our preservation awards, and other fun events, make sure to check those out.
Also, the Riverside Arts Market is a must-visit Saturday destination for locally sourced food, art, entertainment, and more from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m.